So this is a story of many security operations centers encountering cloud for the first time. And this presentation would cover some of the lessons I've extracted from these examples. And there will be some practical advice, but it also would be some soul searching and kind of like a hand wringing and whatnot. So far, my button doesn't have any effect, forward or backward or anywhere. Any advice from the back? Pointed at what? Okay. Oh, I pointed it somewhere. It did work. So for this presentation, I kind of made a framework for approaching things that you've built, you've created in your traditional or regular SOC that break, things that sort of change, and things that sort of have to build from scratch to deal with the cloud side of the house. Now, I may not answer every single question, what to do, what to plan. To me, this is also useful as kind of a frame setter. If you are working for a more traditional organization, you have a SOC, decent detection and response team, and things mostly work out, and then suddenly you realize that you're going to be, your big bosses say that in 3 years you'd be 20% cloud or 80% cloud or whatever that is. So what do you do? What should you fear? What should you strive for? Who should be involved in planning? All that stuff is kind of interesting in many organizations that I've seen. These are sort of left for the latest possible moment when things are already very much going into the ditch. So thinking about this early on really does help. And I'll provide some ways to answer things and some pointers for answers. I wouldn't give you like answers for all of this. This is my, I used to be a Gartner analyst, so I would probably quote Gartner at least once. And in this case, it's a reminder that when I think of a SOC, I think of a team first. To me, this is kind of like a team process tech. And while many of you would look at me and say that's a cliche, it applies to the entire security, people don't behave like this in real life. People, unfortunately, buy tools and hope for the best in many cases. But here, it's a very useful reminder. When I say SOC, I really mean the team. It's really the team first that follows the process, and it may use tech. It may be tech built by Google. It may be tech built by somebody else. I don't know, Splunk or something. The point is that the centrality of a team is quite important. Now, when I was a Gartner analyst a good number of years ago, a lot of people called Gartner and said it's cloud secure. This is a vaguely related slide from my boss, Phil Venables, who had the 8 megatrends, why and how cloud is more secure than pretty much any data center. It's a useful reminder that the questions about can I use cloud, is it secure, is very relevant for 2015. Last time I checked the calendar, it's 2023. To me, that question is solved for pretty much anybody with any degree of sanity. Cloud is more secure than most data centers. It doesn't mean that you won't have bad situations. It doesn't mean you use cloud securely. As my former colleagues at Gartner used to say, cloud is secure, but you're not using it securely. These are all relevant points, but the foundational infrastructure and principles of our cloud and the cloud of our major competitors, of which there are 2, well, us and 2 more, is way more robust than any of us can build in any practical way. So to me, that's not where the problems would come from. Where would they come from? The problems would come from this. Your SOC, which is kind of a spiritual descendant of a NOC circa 1980s, and modern cloud, modern infrastructure. Most of the security operations I've seen really trace their lineage back to the, maybe not literally the 90s, but to the ideas that came from people watching the screens, alerts flicker on the screens, people respond. If they don't know what to do, they escalate. A lot of things that are kind of the pillars of a classic SOC are very real, but they're also not very, in many cases, they clash with the DevOps, modern IT, and very rapid business changes characteristic of the cloud-native environments. So to me, I've seen many SOCs with the classic DNA having major problems dealing with the cloud. And of course, the reason why people at Google don't like the term SOC, and of course, there's no SOC at Google, the O is the problem. Because we don't believe that our detection response team is a O team. It's not, well, it's kind of operating clearly, but it is focused on engineering principles, or it kind of develops stuff that then runs code which deals with SOC tasks. So the reason why our colleagues from Netflix back in the day published the whole SOC-less team, and why there's no door with the name SOC in Google is the same, that the DNA of our operation is very different. And even the word operation here is kind of a little strange. But when you combine this with the rapidly changing cloud environments, you have all sorts of hilarity. And I'll try to explain how to deal with some of this during the presentation. So this is kind of if you have to take a picture, this is probably the slide where the conundrum is presented. Like this, in many cases, the security DNA going back to like, where's the server, what's the IP address, who owns this, what is the business role, clashes with the IT and business realities. And when IT is evolved, but security isn't, a lot of things, well, fun, tricky problems, as I said here. Let's go look at this in detail. Presumably, some things do stay the same. And as I promised, some of the things that you use to create your security operations center, detection and response team, are very much not changing. Ultimately, you can, and I've seen people go too much the other way. Just earlier today, I was fighting somebody on social media, because I do that sometimes. Some people say, we shift left, so we build stuff so securely, we don't need to do anything runtime. Everything is done in gold images and in repo, and everything is immutable, and nobody can hack it, and no changes ever happen, and everything is just perfect from the time we build it. And I thought, wow, you're crazy. I'm not going to talk to you. But the whole shift left is affecting thinking sometimes. And people say, I don't need a SOC. I don't need detection. Everything is built perfectly from the perfect blueprints, and we're going to focus on that thing on the left. To me, that's very dangerous, because ultimately attackers attack. They would find things that we would deal with. The last point is a little subtle, and I'm going to dwell on this a little bit. But ultimately, I do want detection and response. I do want it in 2023. I probably would want it in 2033. I don't think the DNR is going away because somebody managed to build something securely. We built a lot of stuff securely from day one, and we still focus quite heavily on detection and response. The very broad 30,000 feet diagram of collect data, make sense of the data, act on this, definitely stays. There's a lot of things change in nature, but the basic pipeline is still there. Question of threats comes up. And just earlier today, I attended the presentation from my Indian colleagues. I don't see them in the, well, I do see one of them in the room. And the example was from situations when people use cloud and on-prem. And a lot of threats in the cloud are not scary container escapes using 0 days, but because somebody did something in the AD on-premise, and that allowed an attacker who got an account to change things in the cloud. Or sometimes it's the opposite. Somebody synchronized accounts, super admin of some sort, and then people achieved an outcome on-premise and then owned cloud at the same time, or the opposite. So much of the threats do fit into the same bucket. And to me, this is kind of falls into the curiously hard question if you're trying to build a framework on this. While in the media, people assume that you would be owned by something very novel and very cloud native, in reality, you'd probably be owned because of AD. I mean, yeah, that's life. Or because you, as my esteemed colleagues pointed out, provided access to a virtual machine through a proxy, and then you forgot to enable the proxy, or somebody bypassed the proxy. So in that sense, many of the threats really aren't that different. There will be cases when the situations are very different. I've seen some of the kind of cloud-native environments where there's no traditional IT, no VMs. Every endpoint is a Chromebook, and there's no data centers, and there's nothing of that sort. For them, likely what you detect would be different. But for majority of people, the threats is not what changes. Is kind of how things work around the SOC is what changes. This is probably the same picture my Indian colleagues have showed. Hopefully mine is newer, I don't know. The point is that misconfigurations and identity problems is what gets you. And if you are retargeting your detection and response from on-prem to on-prem plus cloud, threats wouldn't be some kind of aliens with blusters. It would be likely things like misconfigured firewall and misconfigured access control, identity too broad, privileges given to wrong people for too long, and all that stuff. So that's kind of good news, and it mostly, as you notice in my presentation, it fits into the things mostly don't change bucket. I really hate in the cloud, you're one IAM mistake away from a breach. I've heard that line many times. I hate it. It's the second hate phrase after a cloud is just somebody else's computer. Because in most cases, cloud is not just somebody else's computer. And in a well-architected cloud, you're not one IAM mistake from a breach. But In a not well-architected cloud, as this picture clearly shows, you are one IAM mistake from breach. And so what you would end up in your detection response posture, you double down on all the logs, all the types of telemetry sources that would allow you to know that it happened. I'm going to skip my turn. Many things really do break. So we went through a bucket. First bucket is some of the things in your SOC, you've built them, they work well, keep them. Make slight changes, make slight adjustments because of the threats, but ultimately things mostly stay. What really does break? We did this survey a few months ago, and data showed that more people focused on DNR, SOCs. I still say in the cloud more difficult. But we never really checked if those people are just coming fresh from on-premise. And we had a decent idea that those people aren't true cloud natives, so cloud first or cloud-born companies. So in that sense, kind of cloud is hard, especially if you don't know it. That's my pithy and somewhat funny take to that. But we still do see that. And I think that this leads to how the SOCs perceive it. If you're really married to where's the server IP, you're not going to have a good time in the cloud. It's painfully obvious if it were 2014. This is 2023, and it still does come up in conversations. The asset model really does change in a significant manner, and that's what pushes things like ASM or discovering attack surface to the front. Because if you had some kind of a developer put together some server with production data in violation of the rules, it used to be behind 5 firewalls in a closet, and now, unfortunately, it's on the public internet. So you will have to discover it much faster. Assuming IT modernized, well, security didn't. A lot of the processes you assume, or SOC would assume, around the SOC and IT look very different. The very first time I entered into a real enterprise SOC was probably in like March or April 2002, and it was a big bang SOC. And one thing they complained about is that to add a log source, they have to file a form, paper form, to enable a syslog configuration, and then the login will start. And I can make jokes about this being 2002, but the problem is that I still see similar processes now, maybe not paper forms, but when they have to open a ticket with a particular IT team and then make a justification for changes to a config file, it's really not how the modern IT would work. And this type of stuff would be a major clash. And if SOC assumes that, they're not going to have a good time. The typical partner for a classic SOC was somebody in IT operations. Unfortunately, while SOC was watching for threats, Ops and Dev formed the unholy alliance called DevOps or whatever else. And in that sense, the developer is the new partner. And many SOCs don't know what to do with them. And cloud, being a largely developer-led environment, produced a lot of really strange and bizarre consequences for detection, including how some things change in a dramatic manner. The applications are built and deployed while SOC is not even aware this is going on. So to me, this is probably the most weird and tricky thing, and there's no more just call the owner of that system and tell them to change something, because the system was instantiated from a pipeline, and there's no owner, and there's like a whole bunch of realities are stacked on top of each other, and they all look very different. Hardware here is kind of like for compliance, because not a lot of this relies on hardware, but the asset model, to me, is the big change. And a lot of assumptions, a lot of practices in a typical SOC rely on these things being true or this being done the old way. And it has not worked well. I mean, yes, of course, I like to write funny blog posts when I highlight how something breaks in this particularly hilarious way. But there's a long list of things that just don't fit. In many SIM tools, you can right-click on the IP address and figure out what the name is and what the owner is and maybe what the location is. I remember using ArcSight a long time ago, and it had this whole right-click open the asset. A lot of this has gone out of the window in the cloud, and the types of context I would need to triage an alert is different. A lot of this is very time sensitive, and the point is that I can shovel stuff in a big pile on the floor, but this stuff ends up being real pain for real people, sitting in SOCs, running SIM tools, collecting cloud data. I've met enough people who say, Oh yeah, sure, I can handle Amazon. Just give me the CloudTrail and I'll put it in my Splunk and I'm done. And yeah, but then all these things come out of the woodwork and bite them, either in sequence or at the same time. And the result is like not a very effective detection and response function. It's the agonizing whack-a-mole with like, oh yeah, I need to figure this one out. Okay, what about this one? What about the collection methods? Well, I'll tell my vendor to build them. Like this stuff is not fun, and this stuff is probably 1/3 in the tooling, 2/3 in the practices. Hey, I just made up the statistic. But it's anchored in tools, but it's also not tools alone. So let's see what things change and how we can track this change and what do we do. So this is, I did a presentation I think a couple of years ago for which we built this slide. And the reason I'm showing it here is that it's a really good 100,000-foot view of like what really must change when you are doing things. Unfortunately, learning cloud and learning cloud IAM, learning the terms from a typical cloud environment, learning the modern IT practices is something that, frankly, can't be avoided by a SOC. And I'm going to make a passionate plea about something very particular in a moment, but ultimately, without learning how Google Cloud works, you probably wouldn't monitor it, no matter what your vendor says. Ultimately, this needs to be built up. The middle sounds painfully obvious. Sure, duh, cloud, shared responsibility. Yeah, we know that. But practically, it's a lot easier for, physical security, cloud provider, some application you just wrote. That's you. Sure, but what about detection and response? How would it work when I'm trying to detect threats using cloud provider tools on a system that I just pushed into the cloud that also calls APIs built by another cloud provider? Shared responsibility becomes really fuzzy in this case. I have a back one slide, please. Sorry, I went too soon. Actually, yeah, I'll stay here. The point is, the things that change do need more attention, and this is kind of the examples. I do see people, perfectly sane people, who insist on having EDR on every cloud instance. It pays the bills for my CrowdStrike colleagues, I'm sure, and everything's fine, but it's kind of a cloud anti-pattern. And it's also when cloud stops being all IaaS and starts being a lot more PaaS and a mixture of PaaS and SaaS. Reliance on my trusty, effective EDR as the main telemetry control, main monitoring control, becomes really tricky, and people have this shock of like, what do you mean I don't have the EDR telemetry? What do I do? Well, go back to this, kind of learn how things are done. Observability is still kind of a hot new thing, but ultimately, if I went to a bunch of SIEM vendors and said, do you have any detection rules or any detection content that runs on observability traces from such and such vendor? And I got blank stares. Maybe they all wrote blog posts how observability is important, but their detection content doesn't reflect it today. So a lot of this, when we are slowly losing OS-level telemetry and EDR telemetry, the whole thing changes, and we would need to change with it. Back to another moment from my Gartner days when we were trying to study SOAR. The acronym SOAR was coined inside Gartner, and when people coined it, they thought, well, there's automation in IT. Maybe we should go talk to them. And they thought about it and decided not to do it. So the point is that there's automation in security, largely centered on SOAR. But there's also a lot of automation in IT. And sometimes there is a mismatch about who's automating what and how. Talking to the people who use various IT automation tools in the DevOps environments, make them realize they haven't heard of SOAR, but a lot of SOAR vendors haven't heard about them. So automation is changing, but it's also need to be reconnected. If you have security automation, if you have IT automation, they better work together, or they better be the same tool. They probably won't be the same tool. I did talk about skills quite a bit, and funny enough, people who resisted learning AppSec, including myself, I'm not an AppSec person. I do feel better with infrastructure and other stuff. As cloud rolls from IaaS to other types of cloud, all this, the functions as a service and the other funny terms that my former colleagues created, AppSec becomes more important in a SOC. And if my SOC is mostly threat people and infrastructure people, you may have to get AppSec talent because a lot of application telemetry otherwise would be quite inscrutable. I want to go through a few details. Of course, you'd see the slides as I leave behind, so there are more details. I probably won't have a chance to go through that. So somebody asked me, OK, Anton, you gave me some mid-level, high-level pointers. What should we actually do day one? And my answer was, sadly, if you're going to read up some documents from GCP or from another cloud provider, you want to double up on IAM. And when I was at Gartner, I made fun of the IAM team, which was not part of a security team. I called the IAM team a password change team, and I made all sorts of fun of them because I felt like IAM was kind of boring. Right now, I don't think IAM is boring anymore because I think IAM is quite exciting. And the reason is IAM is what gets you in the cloud. So if I am trying to build a training curriculum for my SOC analysts who have to now monitor cloud, I send them to IAM documents. And the scariest part is that Google, Amazon, and Microsoft use different terms for similar things, have different elements that work in slightly different ways to configure the IAM, which I guess makes multi-cloud security really fun, but it also makes reading these documents very difficult. IAM is done in a slightly different ways across 3 cloud providers. And unfortunately, if you're in a multi-cloud scenario and your SOC has to monitor more than one cloud, you're learning them and you're finding boxes in your brain to put different things, and you're putting them in the right boxes, because otherwise the term resource means very different things in GCP and in Azure. I've seen people really trip over that one and plant their face in the mud. But that's unavoidable, and that's one area where I almost like if somebody wakes me up at 3 a.m. and says, Anton, tell me one lesson from this presentation. I'll probably say, if you're monitoring cloud, tell your SOC analyst to read up on IAM in the cloud and really comprehend what the mistakes cost and what they mean. So let me go through a few relatively more fun things. I'll skip this. This is not like hugely important. When we talk about doing things together with the cloud provider, I did highlight the whole shared nature of cloud. So people have pictures like on the right and say, oh, shared responsibility. This is you, this is me. We're done. See you later. In threat detection, it's a lot more nuanced, as I'm trying to illustrate. If I use, say, Security Command Center, the GCP threat detection tool, you may be writing your own content, or a third-party partner may be helping you write detections, and then maybe an MDR, another third party, or at this point, what, a fourth party, does the monitoring. So shared responsibility model is not, this is cloud provider, this is client. This may be, this is cloud provider, this is consultant, this is one service provider, this is a co-managed shop. So it's a lot trickier to decouple how shared responsibility works. And this to me is interesting, and it's another one that if I run a SOC and I have to deal with, say, GCP data, some of the data just flows from logs, some of the data I have to request, some of the data may only be there if I configured it, or if my management partner configured it, or an MSP configured it. This makes things changed, and this is not the same of like, hey, enable login and I'm done. Practical lessons from here is that it is not, if you just run a SOC, you kind of almost have this other party in your room, in the physical room. The cloud provider is a constant presence in your SOC, because some things would be changed by a cloud provider, some things you have to request, sometimes you do have to work with people from a cloud provider. Admittedly, in my experience, at least in my recent experience, I've only seen it from a real top-shelf incidents, but 10 years ago, or maybe less than 10 years ago, in the early stages, you do have to request a lot of evidence manually. So that mixes it up. Let's go through a few more useful things that you can apply. So again, back in my Gartner days, I used this framework for use cases, data sources, and methods to assess what I'm detecting and how. And this is kind of my repurposing / corrupting of the old framework. If I am looking at this, and I'm looking at my traditional SOC, I have my SIEM there, I have my detection content, I have my log sources, and I say, OK, I'm fielding a new use case. I need to look for this threat. This is the threat. I have some intelligence. I'm writing rules. I'm shoving them into my production SIEM. And so, of course, this overall process doesn't change. But the fact that the new data sources are there, you have to match mostly the same threats to mostly new data sources, figure out the timings. A few weeks ago, somebody said, why are these logs late by 2 hours? And I say, yeah, that's a good question, but the docs say these logs are late by 2 hours. So yeah, you kind of have to live with that. I mean, this is admittedly not a very self-serving example, but it highlights the fact that in the cloud provider owns some of the things, and sometimes we have to work with the limitations of that. But I'm still applying the same framework just to different log sources, different data sources, largely the same threads, and using methods that are sometimes available from the provider. When we started detecting crypto miners just from a backend in SCC, a lot of people thought it's magic. Somebody was trying to run honeypot, and they wanted crypto miners to run in GCP, but crypto miners were silently killed by that technology. So kind of a funny story, but the point is that in some cases, cloud provider would magically help you. That kind of highlights the value of doing detection in a shared environment. It's just a positive side, not a negative side. To be honest, I want to leave more time for questions. There are some other highlights that you can use using the slides, but I wanted to switch to practical things. But before that, I'm going to go offer one more depressing thought. And the reason is this depressing thought. Actually, if you can see it as a positive way or as a depressing way. This quote I really love. It's Kelly Shortridge talking on our podcast. And this to me is like extra depressing. So I'm sharing it with you, so maybe I feel less depressed. But it is kind of inspired by reality at many organizations. And with this presentation and some other work, I'm trying to subtly change it so that we aren't the guy 10 years behind the guy who's behind the 10 years. Ultimately, we almost need the version of DevSecOps that includes actual SecOps when we are modernizing this. And as I quote myself, sorry, hopefully you apologize. I would apologize for that. But the point is that ultimately, the SOC or DNR team that works in this increasingly cloudy environment would not be an improved SOC of the old times. You will have a lot more. Your SOC would evolve slowly towards this kind of engineering-led operation that Netflix and Google and a few others have been running for a good number of years. And this, to me, is kind of a meta conclusion, but I'll get to more practical conclusions in a moment. The first is not meant as a snide remark, but it kind of comes out as a snide remark. I still see companies that are doing cloud in the way they've done on-premise. And once I got kind of enraged, and I was talking to somebody who is the CISO report at a certain company, and I kind of said, why are you using this on-premise blueprint for cloud? You're in a different environment. And I was kind of like hand-wavy and kind of a little agitated. And the guy looked at me kind of calmly and said, Anton, we are using this blueprint not because we are stupid and not because we think it's a great idea. That's the only one we know. And at which point, as they say in Buddhist stories, I got enlightened. Sometimes it's still something that needs to change, and the change is painful. But I will see companies that follow the on-premise blueprint for securing cloud. People who insist on running NetWitness on any network link in GCP. Yes, they do exist. And of course, NetWitness probably gets millions, tens of millions of dollars from that. And the value of this is largely negative. And not zero. I don't think it's zero. I think it's negative because they spend money and they get not all that much back. But examples like this tell me that people are willing to insist on replicating the on-premise playbook in the cloud, even for cases where it doesn't fit, because most data is encrypted and they can't get the keys to NetWitness. Threats is kind of the bucket of good news. Ultimately, what gets you is largely the same stuff. I was trying to find at least one example when somebody was owned by something truly exotic, very cloud native, and it just doesn't happen all that much. I'm pretty sure I can find one, but it won't be a lot. It won't be a lot. You are likely refining your detection use cases, what you're detecting, what content you're writing, using similar threats, different telemetry, and different processes around the SOC. This is sort of like boring and obvious, but it is difficult for a lot of companies, but it's also kind of how you end up more engineering-led. It's the dissolving of the O in SOC. It's where the O in SOC becomes a D, a development, rather than an improved operation. This is, generally speaking, logs in the cloud will get better with time, and this is kind of a magical positive news. Ultimately, if you have something that we don't make, in a good way, or our logs are slow, or they're not detailed enough, things will get better. That's almost assured. Almost nothing here gets worse. It gets better, sometimes not as fast as we want, but it's still there. To me, this is kind of a big positive of the cloud. Things get better around you in terms of security. The other two is, let me jump to the last one here. Ultimately, people who see this presentation or hear about how they need to change something, they say, but wait a second. We are 95% on-prem and 5% cloud. None of it matters to us because ultimately, if we do things the on-premise way, it will be fine. And my answer is yes, you will be fine, but I really doubt that your cloud usage would stay at this minuscule lift and shifting 5%. It will become more cloud native, it become larger, and ultimately you will need to use ideas from more cloudy blueprints for detection rather than just replicating the on-premise and pushing it harder. So in that sense, you may have to go at your own pace rather than like throw everything away, but this is something that almost certainly will happen with most companies. That's all I had. I did skip over some details, but I think Q&A would be fun. Sure, of course. You're in the front row. You'll be better.
Of course. So in your presentation, you talk about the SOC, but what I'm seeing is multiple SOCs and cloud engineering teams, cloud developers spinning up either using tools like Detective on AWS or buying a second SIEM, like in an Azure, an Azure Sentinel environment. So in your experience, what problems does that cause, and how are you seeing people overcome those problems?
So this presentation is kind of aimed at kind of the original SOC that the company would have had. But in some cases, this is the outcome of a lack of evolution of the main SOC, is that you sort of have the distributed detection response function spontaneously appears, grows out of a cloud team or a separate cloud security team. And then it's hopefully reconnected later on. Like I've seen enough examples when there's like a traditional SOC that dabbles in the cloud, but somebody buys, I don't know, Wiz, and they have a team watching the console, monitoring things, and then ultimately they sort of, the island reestablish the connection with the continent, and then there is either a federated model or some kind of cross connections. This is part of that evolution. Do I think it's lovely and great and beautiful architecturally? No, but it's also reality, and I think that you evolve out of this by eventually either re-centralizing or saying that I'm going to have a federated model. This is the on-prem SOC, this is the cloud detection response team, and there's some kind of team above them that does see both things. Like I've seen all three. But yes, that's one of the scenarios that does come up, when then the SOC not bulging from the server and mainframe roots means that there's a detection response function built on the side. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. You're first.
Quick question. So most of the things that you mentioned are kind of shared services, or not really DevOps kind of managed at this point, right? But you do bring the point that the SOC should be automated and much more engineering in it, and et cetera, so kind of going into the VSOC more in the future. But how do we resolve this challenge of shared services that mostly that we need to produce the logs for DNR, et cetera? They are not DevOps owned or managed at this point, versus we do need DevOps to kind of like come from the top and do that all inside of the engineering.
What do you mean by shared services specifically in this
like
case?
Identity access management, or let's say, for example, network, or even EDR, like endpoint.
Right, but say telemetry for them an application. If it's a platform as a service and there's an app built on a particular platform, the shared services would be kind of identity and probably nothing much else. Everything else would have to come from an app, and that means working with a developer on that side.
Endpoint security, right?
Well, there's no endpoint if it's a platform as a service. There's no E, right? There's no endpoint, and there's no endpoint.
There is no server, but there's
there's-
still user that sits somewhere in a remote location and using that PAS or whatever it is.
Right, but the telemetry that you'd run would come from an application. That means you have to talk to a team that runs the app, right? So it's not really, it wouldn't rely on just identity. You would have to rely on what is the application doing, and for that you would have to talk to whoever built the app.
Application logs are important in that whole schema, but there are still a lot of components that actually not DevOps own.
Right, the
Not
identity-
DevOps own. Managed identity, network, EDR, or endpoint
EDR where
security.
possible, right? Where possible. EDR would not be possible in many cases. So network, yes. Network and identity would remain shared services, and there the need for change is smaller compared to I don't have OS logs anymore because there's no OS. I don't have EDR because there's no E. Give me application login, I don't know what to do with it. Like in that third bucket, I do have to talk to whoever runs the app and whoever makes the logs, right? But yeah, for network and identity, you can change less. But for replacing, say, OS telemetry with an application telemetry, that's a bigger change. And that's a change to your SIEM vendor, it's a change to how SOC does things, and it's a change to the working relationship with the team that owns the app. I can't call the system admin and say, enable login on this server, and they do it, and suddenly they have logs. That route may be gone.
Okay. Thanks.
Have you seen, so we partnered with GCP about a year ago, and we have hospital environments, so we still have network and threats that are in the environment. And so our SOC has probably gotten to 80% of this, where we still have to do network, but then also respond to GCP identity type response. How do you see posture playing out? Typically there was vuln teams that would deal with patching, but when posture comes in cloud around something going wrong, because threats are even differently, they're, inadvertent insider. How do you see posture playing out with a SOC, especially when it can be sort of the root cause of what's bad, activity versus state?
So this is probably a really good MWise 2024 presentation that I'm gonna have to make and submit because it's been coming up a lot in different conversations. Like the SOC is used to calling Qualys, or Qualys data just flows into my SIEM and I have all the context. And suddenly, instead of Qualys scanning the servers, there's some kind of weird stuff coming from some kind of a CSPM, whatever that is, and I need to figure out what it all means, and it doesn't fit into my SIEM. That's kind of an emergent story, and I think that the way I've seen it handled is people who use separate tooling, like for example in your scenario where there's a separate DNR team for cloud, like Wiz. Most of these tools end up integrating VM and posture data. So it's almost like if I have a choice of cloud events flowing into my Splunk, Chronicle, whatever other SIEM, versus having a separate tool that combines telemetry, activity data, but also posture. That starts to favor the tool that does have native cloud posture, rather than trying to scan with a traditional scanner. Then the scanner is like confused about all this stuff, and then I have to deal with it, how it fits into a SIEM. It ends up being not a match. So I would say that as of today, my typical answer to clients going there is that's why your cloud security tool likely includes activity and posture, and the posture isn't very portable into a SIEM or into another tool. It's kind of a half answer, but it's a bigger debate, and I mean, I have to deal with developers a lot more for some of this stuff. Yeah.
I was thinking, and I think my two key takeaways from what you said is that knowledge is really the crucial part, because without the knowledge you don't understand what is staying the same, what is changing.
Yes.
And when you have that knowledge, then you need to engineer your way out. Don't try and use your own DNA, but attack that with an engineering.
That's correct.
mindset.
That's the second kind of a high-level lesson. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's
I think that these are connected because ultimately you are kind of learning how DevOps style IT does things, and then you try to pilfer those lessons and implant them into the SecOps so that it becomes more engineering, and ultimately then the O kind of disappears. That's a hand-wavy way to explain it, but yes, ultimately you're right.
Anton, I have to say, great presentation, first off. Second, you mentioned something on EDRs, and when you were saying you don't need to install EDR across every VM in the cloud, are you saying that from a perspective of compatibility and EDR will not work on some services in the cloud, or more from you don't actually need to extend your EDR across all your VMs in the cloud?
Okay, so this is a good question, and I have a sense why you're asking this. So in my experience, so one thing is enough cloud environments would not have an endpoint, and ultimately EDR wouldn't be possible. Just because somebody has a VM that's, for example, like a long-lasting VM, so like on-premise style, sure, EDR would fit there. So I think that my answer to EDR in the cloud would be that the more your cloud resembles on-prem, the higher the need for EDR. But the less your cloud resembles on-prem, if you have fewer VMs, if you have a lot more short-lived assets, a lot more stuff built from, by automation rather than by humans, it becomes both difficult to do and the value is less. I think that for the cloudier you get, the less possible and the less useful EDR becomes. That's my sort of a short answer. And once I was talking to somebody who was trying to push EDR to every single prod asset, to every single Linux instance they had. And they realized that it's both challenging, expensive, and the value is just not that high because EDR ultimately was born on Windows machines being owned by humans and not on Linux machine being owned by automation. So it's a combination of value and friction. Well, if there are VMs, there are endpoints, but if there are no VMs, then laptops have nothing to do with it. Like these are cloud assets, and I think for laptops, for laptops I would always rely on EDR. I mean, they're really, of course, yeah. I mean, sure, we can sell you a Chromebook, but that's a completely separate story, and I don't have my Noogler hat to go sell you Chromebooks.
Any other questions?
Just along those lines, do you see people migrating off of EDR to? Sure. Do you see customers migrating off of EDR to either more agentless solutions or log-based solutions or things like that? Because our data says the same thing, that EDR agents are the primary monitoring capability today.
But on what? On the Linux, on the container that's built by a pipeline and the human never touches and it lives for 15 minutes, or on a server? On VM, sure. I would probably still use EDR. I mean, there's no, as I said, the more your cloud looks like a data center, the more EDR becomes important, or rather stays being important. But if you don't have any of this, then it becomes a pretty drastic mismatch. Can you force EDR in a container environment? Yes, right now vendors do support that. But what I'm hearing is that both the challenges of running it and the value are both kind of diminished. Yeah. That's a really good batch of questions for a 4 p.m. session. I mean, I love it.
Generally, remediation teams on the vulnerability side and containment teams on the SOC side are completely separate because asset management is so hard. What you're proposing is a combination of those responsibilities, but most of the vulnerability management team's efforts isn't to patch, it's to find who to patch it in an enterprise.
Yeah.
So if SOC analysts or detection analysts, as you're calling them, start doing that's a very dramatic shift in skills. I just want to make sure I understand. Yeah, that's what you're proposing.
I don't recall saying that remediation would fall into SOC. I think that the vulnerability remediation is yet another excellent can of worms to open later on. But to me this fits more with where the signal would go. Instead of SOC sending a 10,000-page PDF to an admin, it would end up being something different, and in many cases dramatically different, right? So But beyond that, I think it's kind of a separate story.
It's something new that's not done traditionally.
Yeah. And that's remediation has been coming up a lot lately, and kind of not connected to a SOC or detection and response, but about, again, vulnerability management is an area where this type of culture mismatch between security and evolved kind of modern IT is also huge, and I think that's why it's worth, I feel I'm exploring it, just I don't have anything published, written, or presented on that. But it's kind of, some of the stuff is even more painful in that domain compared to our domain of DNR. I've seen really strange things happen when people really try to force here's the PDF report, fix it, and people are like, what is all of this? Like, what are you talking about? Like the 2020s DevOps people may not even know what are they talking about. Like, what do you mean this server with an IP? This was created by a pipeline 10 minutes ago, and it's going to be gone in 2 minutes. What are you talking about?
They talk past each other.
Yeah.
And sort of merge some of that. What we've ran into was a posture, which in a sense is a vulnerability in cloud. A containment from a SOC is dealing with the posture. So example, you've got an open, whether your VPCs are open or an open privilege account, but then data could be leaving.
Yes.
You've got to get to the data, close the containment, but it's all posture type stuff. Where in network you might just reimage the machine kind of thing.
Or close it on the firewall in the good old days. But
the criticality is driving almost a vulnerability response that typically would have been sort of an IT process of drift, right? So it's just interesting. SOCs are actually getting to posture response on the criticality. Yes,
and this is another. It's like that is like one step away from conversation over stiff drinks, because like when is a vulnerability an incident in the cloud? It's but I don't have any kind of profound wisdom on this, except for yes, that does happen, and I think that the ultimately the type of remediation that is needed and is suggested by a SOC would sometimes be a mismatch with what IT can do or DevOps can do versus what SOC wants to happen immediately, and then reharmonizing it is kind of a separate process.